Hi everyone. I'm a 34-year-old woman, and my life has always been pretty simple. I've been married to my husband, Dan, 32, for 6 years, and we have a sweet little boy named Simon who just turned 5. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours, our routines, our space, and our way of doing things. That was until my mother-in-law, Linda, 58, came crashing into our lives like an uninvited storm. Linda has always been a lot, the kind of person who manages to be the loudest voice in any room, constantly offering opinions no one asked for. She's the queen of passive-aggressive comments and makes herself the center of attention at every family event. Still, she lived far enough away that her antics were mostly limited to the occasional weekend visit. I could handle that. But then, Linda lost her job. From what I gathered, she had a falling out with her boss. A misunderstanding in her words, though it sounded more like Linda refusing to follow rules. Shortly after that, she lost her apartment too. Apparently, her landlord had unrealistic expectations, though, again, knowing Linda, I'm sure there was more to the story. She called Dan first, telling him she had nowhere else to go and needed her family. Dan, being the empathetic and slightly guilt-prone person he is, immediately started talking about letting her stay with us. I wasn't thrilled. Actually, I was horrified. But Linda knew exactly how to work Dan, layering guilt on thick, and reminding him of everything she'd done for him. It didn't take long before he was nodding along, convinced we were her only option. We sat down to talk about it, and I agreed to let her move in, but only for a month, and with rules. She'd have to respect our house rules, contribute financially, and help out around the house. We wrote everything down so there wouldn't be any confusion later. It felt a little extreme, but I knew how Linda operated. Boundaries were going to be our lifeline. The other team members nodded cooperatively. All of these were in the thread count in the very beginning of our frequency testing modality. Linda moved in a week later, and the chaos began immediately. She walked into our house, looked around, and declared that our open-concept kitchen was tacky. It wasn't even a passing comment. She spent 10 minutes pointing out all the ways we could modernize the space, like tearing down walls and upgrading our appliances. Dan and I exchanged glances, already regretting this. It only got worse when she saw the guest bedroom. She stood in the doorway, shaking her head like a realtor showing a fixer-upper. "This won't work," she said. She wanted new curtains, a firmer mattress, and even suggested repainting the walls. I reminded her that this was temporary, so there was no need to settle in so dramatically. She rolled her eyes and said, "Fine, I'll make do," in the most put-upon tone you can imagine. A few days in, Linda decided she was in charge of the kitchen. She'd start cooking meals unprompted, which might sound helpful, except she completely ignored the fact that I'm allergic to shellfish. Twice, she served dishes loaded with shrimp, claiming she forgot and that I was too picky anyway. After the second incident, I told her firmly that Dan and I would handle the cooking from now on. Her criticisms weren't limited to the kitchen. She made it her mission to critique our parenting. Simon is a sweet, sensitive kid who likes dinosaurs and drawing. Linda, however, thought he was too soft and needed to be toughened up. She scolded him for crying when he fell off his bike, calling it attention-seeking, and suggested Dan take a stricter approach. I told her flat out to leave the parenting to us. But that didn't stop her from sneaking in little lectures to Simon when I wasn't around. As if that wasn't enough, I started noticing my personal belongings weren't where I'd left them. My office desk had been rearranged, and my laptop had mysteriously moved to another room. When I confronted Linda, she brushed it off, saying she was just tidying up, and that the space felt more open her way. It didn't help that she said this with the kind of smile that made it clear she thought she was doing me a favor. The worst moment came when I caught her talking to Simon about moving her bed into his room so she could be closer to family. Simon, bless his heart, looked confused and said he didn't want to share his room. When I asked Linda about it, she played innocent, claiming she was only joking. But it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like another step in her attempt to take over. The final straw for me was when she took our car without asking. She claimed she needed to run a quick errand, but she was gone for hours and brought it back with an empty gas tank. That night, I sat Dan down and told him we needed firmer boundaries. He agreed, but I could tell he felt guilty. Linda had already started whispering in his ear, hinting that I was turning him against her. The month wasn't even halfway over, and it already felt like years. But I wasn't going to let her steamroll me. This was my house, and I wasn't about to lose control of it. Update 1. The first week of Linda's stay had been a whirlwind of chaos, and I realized that the only way to survive the rest of the month was to enforce our house rules with precision. I started keeping a notebook, documenting every infraction. If she crossed a line, I wanted a record of it. It might seem extreme, but with Linda, there was no room for ambiguity. To make my point clear, I began waking up earlier than usual. I'd set up shop in the kitchen, sipping coffee and scrolling through emails while Linda hovered nearby, waiting for her turn. She liked to start her mornings by taking over the space, but by occupying it first, I made it clear that she didn't own the kitchen. The passive-aggressive sighs and muttering under her breath didn't bother me. I was playing the long game. After her second attempt at cooking meals with allergens, I officially revoked her kitchen privileges. The first time, she'd made a shrimp stir-fry, claiming she forgot I was allergic. The second time, she served crab cakes and acted like it wasn't a big deal. I wasn't risking a third. Dan and I agreed that I'd handle the cooking from now on, though Linda loudly complained about how unfair it was. Next, I turned my attention to the guest room. Linda had draped scarves over the lamps, swapped out the bedspread, and even taped pictures of her favorite celebrities on the walls. It looked more like a teenager's dorm room than a guest space. While she was out, I restored the room to its original state. Neutral colors, basic bedding, and no personal touches. When she came back and noticed, she didn't say anything, but the tension in the air was palpable. Linda's manipulation started to become more apparent to Dan, too. I showed him texts she'd sent me where she called me too controlling and hinted that that I was trying to isolate her from him. Seeing her words in black and white seemed to open his eyes. He still felt guilty about the situation, but at least now he wasn't entirely on her side. Dan reached out to me one morning and asked me to come to his house with him so they could have a conversation. I was so excited about this idea. Linda retaliated by leaving passive-aggressive notes around the house. "The atmosphere here is so oppressive," she wrote on a sticky note she left on the fridge. Another one on the bathroom mirror read, "Family should feel like a blessing, not a burden." I ignored them, though I noticed Dan quietly removed them whenever he found one. Simon started picking up on the tension too. One day, he told me that Grandma scolded him for talking back when he said he didn't want to help her carry groceries. He looked confused and a little hurt, and I reassured him that he hadn't done anything wrong. I added that to my notebook. I made a few changes to limit Linda's access to communal areas. Subtle things, moving the couch slightly closer to the wall, shifting chairs so they blocked her usual paths, and rearranging the kitchen pantry so her snacks were harder to reach. None of it was overtly hostile, but it sent a message. This house wasn't hers to control. I also installed a lock on my office door. After finding my desk and computer moved for the third time, I decided enough was enough. Linda didn't have any business being in there, and now she physically couldn't get in. When she noticed, she muttered something about me being paranoid, but I didn't care. One evening, I overheard Linda on the phone with a friend, complaining about how she was trapped in a dictatorship. She went on and on about how Dan and I were treating her like a prisoner and how she deserved better. I stayed quiet, but I added it to my mental list of reasons why this trial period couldn't end fast enough. The final straw came when I found out Linda had been trying to set Dan up on lunch dates with his ex-girlfriend, under the guise of catching up. She claimed it was just for fun, but the intent was clear. When I showed Dan the messages, he was furious. For the first time, he confronted Linda about her behavior. She deflected, of course, claiming she only wanted what was best for him. Dan didn't buy it. Linda didn't take the confrontation well. A few days later, while Dan and I were out running errands, Linda hosted an unannounced dinner party for her friends. We came home to find half a dozen strangers in our dining room, laughing and eating like they owned the place. I didn't lose my temper. I simply asked everyone to leave, thanked them for coming, and started clearing the table. Linda fumed but couldn't argue without looking like the bad guy. That night, I issued an ultimatum. If she disrupted our home like that again, her trial period would end early. Linda accused me of being heartless, and for a moment, I thought she might start crying. But the cracks in her resolve were starting to show. She wasn't as confident as she'd been when she first moved in, and that gave me hope. 1 month was starting to feel like an eternity, but I wasn't giving up. Linda might have been an expert at manipulation, but this was my home, and I was determined to take it back. Update 2. After the unannounced dinner party fiasco, I decided it was time to take control of the situation before things spiraled further. I implemented a new house rule: quiet hours from 9 p.m. onward. No TV, no loud phone calls, nothing. Linda grumbled about how unreasonable it was, but she didn't have much choice. The first couple of nights, I caught her accidentally watching TV past the cutoff time, but after I unplugged the living room television for a week, she got the message. Next, I added some safety upgrades to the kitchen. I installed child-proof locks on the drawers and cabinets where we kept sharp knives, heavy pots, and certain ingredients she liked to use. When Linda found herself locked out of her favorite pantry shelf, I told her we had to be cautious for Simon's sake. She couldn't argue with that, though her frustration was obvious. One morning, I noticed my work computer wouldn't turn on. After some fiddling, I discovered the power cord had been unplugged. Luckily, I'd installed discreet security cameras in my office after locking the door. Sure enough, the footage showed Linda sneaking in while I was out. She'd unplugged the computer and then sat in my chair, flipping through papers on my desk. When I confronted her with the evidence, she stammered about just cleaning up. I didn't press further, but made a mental note to tighten security even more. Linda wasn't shy about making her feelings known. Every time I walked past her, she'd mutter something snide under her breath, like how I was destroying family harmony. I started recording these comments and played them back for Dan during our conversations. At first, he seemed reluctant to listen, but as the recordings piled up, he couldn't deny what was happening. I could see his patience with Linda was wearing thin. Her next tactic was to weaponize nostalgia. She started bringing home old knickknacks and photo albums from Dan's childhood. One evening, I found her rearranging the living room shelves, filling them with Dan's old soccer trophies and school photos. I knew what she was doing, trying to manipulate Dan by reminding him of better times. I responded by designating certain areas of the house as memory-free zones, and asked Dan to help me keep those spaces clear. He agreed, though I could tell it was hard for him. Linda began inviting extended family members over, claiming she wanted to reconnect. When I found out, I reminded her of the house rules: no visitors without prior permission. She tried to argue, but I stood firm, saying we couldn't accommodate guests right now. A few family members even called me afterward, hinting that I was being unreasonable, but I shut that down by explaining our boundaries. Most of them backed off after hearing my side of the story. At that point, her financial struggles became the next point of contention. She started exaggerating how little money she had, conveniently forgetting to contribute to household expenses as she'd promised. I decided to keep track of everything: food, utilities, gas, and even the extra cleaning supplies I had to buy because she refused to help with chores. At the end of the month, I handed her a detailed invoice. She looked stunned but didn't argue, which was satisfying in its own way. As the days passed, her complaints grew louder. She claimed the house was too small and inhospitable, making it impossible for her to feel comfortable. At first, Dan tried to sympathize, but even he started getting tired of her constant negativity. Sarah began to distance herself, spending more time with Simon, or at work to avoid Linda's never-ending drama. Linda didn't take this lying down. She called other family members, painting me as a controlling monster who was trying to isolate her. To my relief, most of them either ignored her or refused to get involved. The few who did reach out to Dan quickly backed off when he explained what had really been going on. I started researching local low-hanging housing options, printing out brochures and leaving them on Linda's nightstand. I didn't say anything about them, but the message was clear. Soon after, Linda began spending more time out of the house. She never said where she was going, but I had a feeling she was testing the waters elsewhere. It was a relief, even if it was temporary. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt like I was gaining the upper hand. Linda's grip on the household was slipping, and she seemed to know it. But I also knew her well enough to realize she wouldn't give up without a fight. The next few weeks would determine whether we could finally reclaim our home. Update 3. Just when I thought things were finally settling down, Linda pulled another stunt. One afternoon, I came home from picking Simon up from preschool to find a group of strangers in my living room. Linda had invited a few of her friends over for what she called a quick get-together. Plates of snacks were scattered across the coffee table, and they were laughing loudly, completely ignoring the house rule about no visitors without prior approval. I calmly walked into the room, greeted the guests, and announced that it was time for the party to end. Linda looked mortified, but I wasn't about to let her slide. One by one, I politely ushered everyone out, thanking them for coming. The entire time, Linda sat on the couch glaring at me like I'd just ruined her life. As soon as the last guest left, Linda accused me of humiliating her in front of her friends. She stormed off to her room, slamming the door behind her. Not long after, I noticed she'd started packing. She dragged out her suitcases, making a show of folding clothes and stuffing them into bags while sighing loudly. It was clear she wanted us to think she was leaving on her own terms. I didn't take the bait. Instead, I offered to help with her moving arrangements. I casually reminded her of the housing brochures I'd left in her room and mentioned that I could help her look into them. Linda froze for a moment, clearly not expecting me to be so calm. Then she shifted gears, launching into a guilt trip about how she had nowhere to go and how cruel it was to force family onto the streets. I didn't argue. I simply pulled out the brochures again and pointed out several options she could explore. Linda tried to keep the dramatics going, but her performance was losing steam. She realized she wasn't going to get the emotional reaction she was hoping for. That evening, Sarah surprised me by fully siding with me for the first time. She told Linda that this wasn't about abandoning her, but about setting healthy boundaries for our family. Linda wasn't happy. She lashed out at Sarah, calling her ungrateful and accusing her of betraying her own mother. Sarah didn't back down, though, and that seemed to be the final crack in Linda's facade. Later that night, Simon asked me a question that broke my heart a little. Is Grandma going to come back when she leaves? I reassured him that we would always see Grandma, just not in our house anymore. It was clear the tension in the home had affected him, and I couldn't wait to get things back to normal for his sake. The next morning, Linda tried a new tactic, claiming she couldn't leave because she'd misplaced her important documents. Birth certificates, financial paperwork, you name it, she couldn't find it. I offered to help her replace everything. I even showed her a website where she could order duplicates and offered to pay the fees. Her frustration was palpable, but she couldn't argue with my solution. With her excuses running out, I set a firm move-out deadline. I told Linda that by the end of the week, she needed to have her arrangements finalized. There would be no extensions. She called me heartless again, but at this point her words had lost their sting. She knew the clock was ticking. When moving day arrived, I did everything I could to make the process smooth and quick. I helped pack her last few items, loaded her suitcases into the car, and even stayed cheerful throughout the ordeal. Linda tried to guilt-trip me one final time, lamenting how she never expected to be treated this way by family. I simply smiled and wished her the best in her new chapter. I tried to say a few things to make her feel. As the car pulled away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The house instantly felt quieter, lighter, almost as if it was breathing a sigh of relief. Dan and I spent the rest of the day reclaiming the guest room, moving the furniture back into place, and scrubbing away any lingering traces of Linda's stay. That night, we had our first peaceful dinner in weeks. Simon even seemed more relaxed, chatting away about his favorite dinosaurs like nothing had happened. Looking back, I realized this ordeal had brought Dan and me closer together. We'd faced a storm and come out stronger on the other side. As for Linda, I hoped she found what she was looking for. But one thing was clear. Our home was ours again, and I wasn't about to let anyone take that away from us. Update 4. A week after Linda moved out, things finally felt normal again. Or so I thought. One morning, while scrolling through my phone, I came across a post from Linda on social media. She had written a long, dramatic rant claiming I had forced her into the streets and broken up the family. She painted herself as a victim of cruelty, conveniently leaving out the part where she ignored every boundary we set. The post quickly gained traction among extended family members. Calls and messages started pouring in, mostly to Sarah. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who hadn't spoken to us in months were suddenly full of opinions about how Sarah had abandoned her mother. A few even accused me of being controlling and manipulative, fueling Linda's narrative. Sarah tried to ignore the comments, but it was clear the situation was wearing on her. At first, I told Sarah not to engage. People would believe what they wanted to believe, and arguing with them would only make things worse. But Linda wasn't done. A few days later, she escalated by tagging Sarah in another post, publicly calling her out by name. The post accused Sarah of being a selfish daughter who had turned her back on family values. It was the kind of thing that couldn't be ignored. Sarah hit her breaking point. She broke down one evening, overwhelmed by the messages and the constant accusations. She felt torn. Loyalty to me, loyalty to Simon, and the pressure to be a good daughter all clashing at once. I knew I had to step in. I drafted a calm, factual response to Linda's posts. I kept it short and to the point, outlining the house rules Linda had agreed to before moving in and listing the ways she'd violated them. I avoided any emotional language, sticking to the facts. Once I posted it, the tide began to shift. A few family members who had initially sided with Linda started reaching out privately, admitting they hadn't heard the full story. Linda didn't take it well. She responded with even more dramatics, accusing me of lying and twisting the truth. Her posts grew increasingly unhinged, and it was clear she was trying to drum up sympathy by any means necessary. Then, out of the blue, one of Linda's friends messaged Sarah. She revealed that Linda had been staying in a mutual friend's guest house, rent-free, and wasn't nearly as homeless as she claimed. It was the break we needed. Using this information, I subtly shifted the narrative. I didn't call Linda out directly, but made a few posts about how grateful I was for people who helped family during tough times, subtly pointing out that Linda wasn't as helpless as she wanted everyone to think. It worked. More and more people began questioning her story. Sarah started standing up for herself too. When relatives called to criticize her, she calmly explained everything Linda had done during her stay. Some backed off immediately while others doubled down. But Sarah didn't let it get to her anymore. She even began blocking people who refused to listen. Just as things seemed to calm down, Linda showed up at our house unannounced. Simon and I were playing in the living room when I heard her knocking on the door. When I opened it, she was standing there, demanding to see Simon. She claimed she had a right to see her grandson and refused to leave until she did. I kept my composure. I reminded Linda that she was no longer welcome at our home and that if she didn't leave, I'd have no choice but to call the authorities. Linda tried to argue, saying I was trying to erase her from Simon's life, but I stood firm. Eventually, she left, but not before loudly announcing that I was poisoning Simon against her. After that incident, Sarah made a difficult decision. She blocked Linda's number and instructed Simon not to answer the door if Grandma ever showed up again. It was heartbreaking, but it was necessary. Simon didn't fully understand, but he nodded and went back to his toys, which only reinforced how much Linda's presence had disrupted our lives. Linda's next move was to leave handwritten letters in our mailbox. They were addressed to Sarah and filled with emotional manipulation and veiled threats. She wrote about how she was praying for Sarah to come to her senses and accused her of being a pawn in my scheme. I kept the letters, adding them to the growing pile of evidence in case things escalated further. Finally, I decided to take legal precautions. I began researching no-contact orders and other legal measures to protect my family if Linda continued her antics. It wasn't a step I wanted to take, but after everything we'd been through, I wasn't willing to let her disrupt our peace again. The fallout from Linda's departure had been exhausting, but it also showed me how resilient Sarah and I had become as a team. Linda's smear campaign might have rattled us, but it didn't break us. And now we were ready for whatever came next. Update 5. After weeks of chaos, Linda's smear campaign started losing momentum. At first, her dramatic posts had rallied a handful of family members, but as time went on, people began noticing the inconsistencies in her story. Her claims that she'd been forced into homelessness didn't add up when she was still posting photos from a cozy guest house. Some of the relatives who had been the loudest in criticizing Sarah and me began quietly backing off, but Linda wasn't done stirring the pot. One evening, I got a call from an old friend who had seen another one of Linda's posts. This time, she accused us of stealing her money during her stay. According to her, we drained her savings to fund our lavish lifestyle. I knew it was a blatant lie, but the accusation couldn't go unanswered. I gathered every receipt and document from Linda's time at our house. Grocery bills, utilities, and the invoice I'd given her for her share of expenses. It was all meticulously recorded, showing she hadn't contributed a single cent. I uploaded a single post with the receipts, captioned, "For transparency." It didn't take long for the tide to turn. People who had sided with Linda began apologizing to Sarah, admitting they'd been misled. Some even called out Linda publicly, asking her to explain the discrepancies. She responded by doubling down on her lies, but her credibility was crumbling fast. Then Linda escalated to something I never expected. One afternoon, a child services worker showed up at our door. Linda had filed a complaint, alleging that Sarah and I were unfit parents. She claimed Simon was being neglected and living in an unsafe environment. The worker was professional and polite, but I could see she wasn't buying Linda's story. We showed her around the house, provided Simon's medical and school records, and even mentioned the security cameras that had captured Linda's antics during her stay. The case was dismissed within days, but the stress of the situation was exhausting. After that, Sarah and I decided it was time to consult a lawyer. We needed to protect ourselves from further attacks. The lawyer recommended a cease and desist letter and laid out the steps we could take if Linda continued her harassment. It wasn't the route we wanted to go, but Linda had left us with no choice. Linda didn't take the hint. A week later, she showed up at Sarah's workplace unannounced, demanding to speak with her. She caused a scene in the lobby, yelling about how Sarah had abandoned her own mother. Security was called and Linda was escorted out, but not before half the office had witnessed the commotion. Sarah filed a formal complaint with the building, ensuring Linda would be barred from returning. That evening, Samantha asked a question that caught me off guard. "Why is Grandma mean?" It was heartbreaking to hear, but it was clear he'd picked up on the tension. Sarah and I sat him down and explained family boundaries in a way he could understand. We told him that sometimes adults don't get along, and it's okay to set rules to keep everyone safe and happy. He nodded thoughtfully and went back to building his Lego spaceship. To ensure our family's safety, I installed additional security measures at home. A doorbell camera, motion sensors, and a reinforced lock on the front door gave us peace of mind. Linda wasn't dangerous, but her unpredictability made us cautious. We couldn't afford to take any chances. Around this time, we got an unexpected call from the friend who had been housing Linda. She told Sarah that Linda had overstayed her welcome and was refusing to leave. It was clear she hoped we would intervene, but we decided not to get involved. Linda needed to face the consequences of her behavior without us bailing her out. As the dust settled, Sarah and I had time to reflect on everything we'd been through. The experience had been draining, but it also brought us closer together. We'd learned to set boundaries and stand by them, no matter how much pushback we faced. Our home felt like ours again, peaceful, safe, and filled with love. The final twist came when Linda's smear campaign completely backfired. Mutual acquaintances began cutting ties with her, fed up with her lies and manipulations. The relatives who had initially supported her were silent, and her social media posts started getting fewer and fewer likes. Linda, who had thrived on attention and drama, was suddenly left with no audience. For the first time in months, I felt like we could breathe. Linda had created a storm, but in the end, it was her own behavior that left her isolated. As for us, we were finally able to move on, stronger and more united than ever.